Good evening, I'm Amna Nawaz. Judy Woodruff is away. On the NewsHour tonight, Presidents Biden and Putin hold a second call in the same month as Russian troops mass on the Ukrainian border. Then, a Texas law banning transgender athletes from playing sports goes into effect next month, adding to the challenges trans kids already face growing up. And a look at America's broken foster care system and one former foster child's approach to fixing it.
All the time, we see these small barriers as like a deposit for an apartment or the need for more food being the barrier that actually blocks families from staying together.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Fidelity dedicated advisors are here to help you create a wealth plan. A plan with tax-sensitive investing strategies. Planning focused on tomorrow, while you focus on today. That's the planning effect from Fidelity.
Johnson & Johnson, BNSF Railway, Consumer Cellular, Financial services firm Raymond James, the Kendeda Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at KendedaFund.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at Carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin have spoken again for 50 minutes amid ongoing tensions over Ukraine. The White House says Mr. Biden warned Russia again not to invade Ukraine. The Kremlin says President Putin warned that any new sanctions would mean a complete breakdown in relations. The two leaders had an initial call earlier this month. Formal security talks begin next month, and we will have much more after the news summary. On the pandemic, new hospitalizations of children rose 66% last week. Daily admissions are now the highest of the pandemic. And infections among nursing home workers jumped 80%. Today, federal health officials appealed to that group to get boosters. Meanwhile, the New York Times and others reported that on Monday, the FDA will authorize Pfizer vaccine boosters for kids 12 to 15 years old. And a South African study found Johnson & Johnson's booster cut the risk of hospitalization in Omicron cases by 85%. The Omicron surge is also forcing U.S. cities to decide whether or not they'll go ahead with New Year's Eve celebrations. Today, crews in New York prepared for the annual ball drop in Times Square. Outgoing Mayor Bill de Blasio said the festivities will move forward as planned.
It's going to be outdoors, vaccination only, masks required, socially distanced. But we want to show that we're moving forward, and we want to show the world that New York City is fighting our way through this.
Boston is also pressing on with its New Year's plans, but concerts and other events are being moved outdoors to allow for more spacing. And the CDC warned today against going on cruises. It said the chance of getting infected is very high, regardless of vaccination status. In Sudan, security forces reportedly killed at least 4 protesters today amid mass rallies against the military regime. A medical group says it happened in Omdurman, where security forces opened fire on crowds. Thousands also protested in Khartoum. Security forces there used tear gas and live ammunition to disperse the crowds, demanding a return to civilian rule.
Our position is clear. We are opposed to any negotiations, partnership, or compromise with the generals. We came out today to bring down this ruling military council and to have a civilian democratic government afterwards.
Major demonstrations have rocked Sudan since October's military coup, despite tightened security measures. Mourners lined up in South Africa today to pay respects to the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He lay in state at St. George's Anglican Cathedral in Cape Town, where he had preached against racial injustice. Hundreds filed past the simple pine casket.
I'm here to say goodbye, but to also celebrate the Bishop, Archbishop Tutu, because he's meant so much to me in my life. I've had fond memories of meeting and spending time with him, and I think I want to be, he's left that impression on me that integrity, character, and service is everything.
The lying in state continues tomorrow. A requiem mass and funeral will take place on New Year's Day. Tutu died Sunday at the age of 90. Back in this country, a wind-driven wildfire in Colorado forced evacuations of nearly 35,000 people from two towns near Denver. Smoke rose over neighborhoods in Superior and Louisville, and cars lined up trying to leave the area. Winds gusting to 100 miles an hour were pushing the flames. The latest winter storm in the Pacific Northwest socked in a major highway for much of the day. Heavy snow shut down about 80 miles of Interstate 90 across Washington state. The same storm has iced local roads in the region and tangled up traffic in Seattle and Portland. The Arctic blast is expected to last until the weekend. Teva Pharmaceuticals was found guilty today of fueling opioid addiction in New York State. A jury said the company used misleading marketing tactics that had lethal consequences. A separate trial will determine damages. All told, more than 3,000 opioid-related lawsuits are pending in the United States. In economic news, first-time claims for jobless benefits dropped last week by 8,000 to 198,000, and the four-week average was the lowest since 1969. The numbers indicate that the Omicron surge has yet to trigger new layoffs. And on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 90 points to close at 36,398. Then Nasdaq fell 24 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 14. Still to come on the NewsHour, inside Turkey's battle with a Kurdish separatist movement in Iraq. Two critics give their best takes on the best of books of 2021. Some reflections on a challenging year, plus some reasons to be hopeful, and much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Today, President Biden spoke by phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin, their second call in a month, as seen in this photo released by the White House. The call came amid a crisis over Ukraine, where 100,000 Russian troops are massed on Ukraine's borders, and U.S. officials are concerned that Russia could invade. Nick Schifrin is here now to tell us how the call went. Nick, good to see you. So you've been talking to your sources, the administration. What are they saying about that call?
A senior administration official who just briefed reporters called the call, quote, serious and substantive, a kind of setup for the tone and tenor for in-person discussions between the U.S. and Russians and their allies in early January. It lasted about 50 minutes and was made at the request of Vladimir Putin, which is unusual, and took place after 11 p.m. in Moscow. Now, Putin has made it clear he wants fundamental changes in U.S. and allied policy, a guarantee that Ukraine can never join NATO, a reversal of NATO expansion since 1997, and no U.S. exercises in much of Eastern Europe. That would reverse decades of U.S. policy, and U.S. officials have made it clear some of that is dead on arrival. But today, the senior administration official reiterated that the U.S. is eager to hear Russian concerns and priorities, and in return, will share U.S. concerns and U.S. priorities, most notably that huge mass of additional Russian troops who played not really only near Ukraine, but really around Ukraine in 4 different spots, as you can see on this map that's created by U.S. intelligence, which believes that Russia has planned for as many as 170,000 troops to invade. The White House reiterated that President Biden told Putin that diplomatic progress could only take place in the context of de-escalation of those Russian troops. And Amna, a few minutes after the call ended, just before 6 p.m. Eastern, Russian state-owned media quoted a senior Russian diplomat as claiming that President Biden promised not to send any, quote, offensive weapons to Ukraine. At this hour, the White House has not responded to that claim, but in general, Amna, U.S. officials refer to the weapons they send to Ukraine as defensive, not offensive.
So, Nick, the U.S. says to have any progress, they need to see de-escalation from Russia first. Is there any chance of that happening?
There's not really a sign of that. U.S. officials do admit there's some troop movement, but they say those troops have not de-escalated and have not redeployed back inward to Russia. So as the U.S. tries to find a diplomatic off-ramp, it's also trying to deter a Russian invasion by threatening extensive U.S. and allied economic sanctions, more troops deployed to Eastern European NATO allies, and more weapons for Ukraine, on top of $450 million worth of weapons it's already sent, including anti-tank javelins. The U.S. is also working to find steps that Ukraine can make to address Russian concerns in eastern Ukrainian Donbass region, where Russian troops partially occupied and where Moscow supports Ukrainian separatists. Longer term, that could include amnesty for those separatists, as well as more autonomy and elections in the Donbass. But Russian actions have essentially coalesced Ukrainian politics against the Kremlin, making any Ukrainian concessions extremely difficult. They've also coalesced NATO. And in this country, Republicans have warned Biden not to make any concessions to Putin. So those concessions that Russia is asking for, it's very difficult for the U.S. and their allies to make.
So, Nick, you mentioned those upcoming in-person meetings in January between Russian officials, U.S. officials, and their allies. What does that look like? What happens next?
Yeah, so 3 distinct diplomatic meetings in early January. The first one, January 9th to 10th, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman will meet her equivalent, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. On January 12th, NATO and Russia will meet to discuss Russian demands of the future of NATO. And on January 13th, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, which includes the Russians, the U.S., and the Ukrainians, will meet, allowing the Ukrainians to be at the table. Amna, the stakes are high. Putin could still decide to invade, according to U.S. officials. And as the number 3 State Department official told us on the show just a few weeks ago, if democracies stand by and allow that invasion to happen, it will embolden autocrats everywhere. And that's why the U.S. is so concerned and so looking forward to that diplomacy in early January.
That is Nick Schifrin with the very latest on that call just today between Presidents Biden and Putin. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, transgender rights have been front and center for the last year. And in the next few weeks, a new law will take effect in Texas, banning transgender student athletes from playing sports that match their gender identity. According to the ACLU, Texas is one of 31 states that's introduced or passed similar legislation. And studies show even the debate over limiting trans rights takes a toll on mental health for trans youth. First, Alice Scott from our student reporting labs talks to 2 teens in Texas.
I'm just a normal teenager, and I'm figuring out what my normal is.
Jake Wagner, a 9th grader from Austin, Texas, came out as transgender in November of 2020. His process of both forming and forging his identity was a normal part of his adolescence, much like Wednesday Gomez, a 10th grader, also from Austin, Texas, whose views on gender and sexuality have also recently become more clear.
I'm non-binary, which means I'm not a boy or a girl, and I don't really identify with either of those things. I kind of everything and nothing at the same time.
Many teens and their families are learning the value of self-discovery. According to national surveys from the CDC, the percentage of young people ages 15 to 17 who identify as non-heterosexual grew from just over 8% in 2015 to nearly 12% in 2019.
I had a really hard time, being able to be happy before I came out. I was sort of yeah, I am happy, but I'm not being myself and being happy at the same time, which felt really off for me. Even though I don't know a lot of things right now, as a younger person, I know who I am.
The process of coming out looks different for each person who goes through it.
Mentally, I've just been a lot happier because I feel like I've always tried to keep this in my own head, because I didn't really know what it was or how to explain it. But then when I came out, I was just okay. And I felt so much more mental freedom.
I've been feeling so much more connected to myself and represented in my like life. And every time someone refers to me correctly, it just really helps me feel very much like secure and grounded in my identity.
When people ask, like,
with more than 3 out of 4 transgender and non-binary youth experiencing symptoms of anxiety disorder last year, many are looking for more support.
I think today's youth are really aware of the fact that they don't have to fit into a box.
Or you want songs.
Families can model supportive behavior for others to follow, such as using gender-inclusive language, respecting pronouns, and avoiding dead naming, the use of the person's former name, to better create an open dialogue and promote acceptance.
It's not about you. Like, your job is to show up and love your kid unconditionally. Your sweet baby is the same like sweet baby that you always had and watched grow up. The transition doesn't undo or make them a different person.
Having a supportive community can give transitioning teens an open space to communicate and express what they need to feel safe.
I think it's important for everybody to express themselves and just like live as the person that they want to be.
It's okay to not know who you are, and you'll figure it out eventually, and it's important to feel supported even if you aren't quite sure what you need to be supported in quite yet.
For the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs, I'm Alice Scott in Austin, Texas.
For more on the laws limiting transgender rights and their effect on mental health, we're joined by Jonah DeChance, a research scientist for the Trevor Project, which is a suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. Jonah, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you for your time. As you and your colleagues well know, because you have been tracking this, 2021 saw a record number of anti-trans bills in state legislatures across the country. So tell us a little bit more about those. What is it that those bills seek to do?
Yes, so we are unfortunately seeing a surge in anti-LGBTQ and particularly anti-trans and non-binary legislation, both in Texas and across the United States. These bills include things like banning trans and non-binary youth from participating in sports, banning their access to affirming health care, limiting their access to privacy in school, and other ways of generally just making it harder for them to express their identities and feel supported in their homes and their communities.
And your tracking shows we're talking about a majority of states now. It's a majority of states where these actions have been taken, either considering or passing anti-trans legislation specifically. But I have to ask you, a NewsHour NPR Marist poll from earlier this year showed that actually a majority of Americans oppose those kinds of measures. We're talking about 2/3 of Americans, and that includes majorities of all political ideologies and all age groups. So what do lawmakers argue is the need behind those rules and laws?
Yeah, the rationale behind these laws varies based off of, the particular law, whether we're talking about healthcare or sports. Particularly looking at sports, there are folks who claim that they are protecting competitiveness for cisgender girls. However, there are other sporting organizations such as the International Olympic Committee and the NCAA, which do allow transgender athletes to participate in ways that align with their gender identity. And so we believe at the Trevor Project that these bans, whether they are about healthcare or sports, are simply opportunities to discriminate and continue to stigmatize trans and non-binary youth and their identities.
Let's talk about the mental health impact of all this. We just heard from Jake and Wednesday sharing their experiences. From your research, from people you talk to, what is the mental health impact, particularly on trans kids, even when legislation like this is just being debated?
Yes, so the impact we see at the Trevor Project, both in our research and in our crisis services, is that these types of legislation, and just as you said, the discussion about the legislation, increase discrimination, harassment, again, stigmatization, social isolation for trans and non-binary youth, who are already a group of young people who are very vulnerable to harassment and discrimination and who experience negative mental health impacts. Our research has shown that 94% of LGBTQ youth report that recent politics had negatively impacted their mental health. We are also hearing directly from young people in Texas in our crisis services who are saying that they are trans and non-binary, and that the onslaught of over 40 anti-trans bills in their state this year has caused them to feel stress and even consider suicide.
To put a finer point on that, I mean, we all know the pandemic years have exacerbated an existing mental health crisis, particularly among young Americans, but your research specific to trans kids is really worth pointing out. This is so disturbing. When you look at the numbers, 61% of trans youth report being bullied, 32% of bullied trans youth attempted suicide in the last year, and trans and non-binary youth are twice as likely to experience depression. Jonah, by those numbers, that means 1 out of every 5 roughly trans kids attempted suicide last year. I mean, do you see those kinds of numbers anywhere else?
No, those are uniquely high numbers compared to other LGB youth and compared to straight and cisgender youth. And here at the Trevor Project, what we really see is that those numbers are the result of mistreatment that young people experience. It's the result of not having families who are able to support them, of feeling bullied and harassed in school, feeling like they're unable to update their identity documents to align with their identity, feeling banned from participating in school activities. So it is this cumulative onslaught of having your right to participate in society be attacked that can really cause folks to be at elevated suicide risk and increased negative mental health.
Jonah, in the few seconds we have left, we have to remind everyone we're talking about kids, right? Kids who deserve to feel safe and loved like any other kid. So what is your message to adults about how they can make sure that happens?
Thank you for asking that. The other trend that we see in all of our research is that being an ally matters. We see that when young people have supportive adults in their life, when there are people who are affirming them at school, when there are people who are using their name and their pronouns correctly, all of those contribute to better mental health and decreased suicide risk. And so all of those small actions that we can take as adults to support young people, whether that's displaying a pride flag on your classroom, whether that's if you're a sports coach discussing LGBTQ issues with your athletes, all of those things are things that young people pick up and that they tell us make them feel safe and affirmed and that benefit their mental health.
That is Jonah Deschamps, research scientist for the Trevor Project. Jonah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
There are currently more than 400,000 children in foster care in the U.S. And while the pandemic has made life even more difficult for these vulnerable kids, many say the foster care system itself has been putting them at risk for decades. Special correspondent Charlene Hunter-Gault sat down with one former foster child who's now on a mission to fix the system by helping families stay together in the first place. It's part of our Race Matters series and Charlene's ongoing reporting on racism in America.
Ready for your popsicle?
Meet 61-year-old Valencia Polk.
Hold it right here.
Her 6 grandchildren came to live with her after Child Protective Services removed the children from their parents due to neglect allegations. It was a lot to take on, but the grandmother never thought twice. Then, after a few months, and without warning, all 6 of the children were taken from her and put in a foster home. She was never given a specific reason.
They told me, we're going to take the children. I cried, of course, they're my kids. Why are you going to take the kids? We don't think you can handle it. When they took them, they were sitting in the floor doing their homework, and they came and got them. Screaming and crying, please, please, help me, help me, help me. And then till I had to leave, I said I got to go back in the house because I just felt like I was going to fall on the ground.
Polk says the children were physically and verbally abused in foster care, adding they were dirty during supervised visits. The trauma led each of the children to start shutting down in different ways. 8-year-old BJ stopped doing his schoolwork.
He told me out of his own mouth, he said, I don't want to do better until I go home. That's what he told me, so that's what I'm dealing with. The 3-year-old that's in there, the boy wouldn't say nothing. They thought he was deaf and dumb. They were teaching him sign language. I told him, I said, he's not deaf and dumb. You broke him.
Then, just as suddenly as they were taken away, 3 of the children were given back to Polk, again without explanation. All this is avoidable trauma caused by a broken system, according to Sixto Council. It's cases like this one that led the 29-year-old former foster child to start a nonprofit called Think of Us. It collects these kinds of stories, brings them to Washington, and advocates for change that would help families like the Polks stay together. On this night, Council visited the Polks with Valerie Jackson of Monarch Family Services, the child placing agency helping Polk obtain permanent guardianship.
This is how we find out, is by talking to real human beings. Like, we have to hear from all sides.
I met Sixto Council near the Polk home in Houston, Texas, to hear more about his ideas on what needs to change, ideas fueled equally by his own traumatic childhood.
Just how typical is what we've just seen?
This is a story that we see over and over and over. And all the time, we see these small barriers as like a deposit for an apartment or the need for more food being the barrier that actually blocks families from staying together, or these technicalities that a family might need to be licensed to take care of their children, their relatives.
Yeah, but even in your own life, I mean, you're now 29, and you've had this experience, like, in a way, like this family, since you were 11 months old. What was that like?
Unfortunately, my mother couldn't take care of us because of her drug addiction. And by the age of 9, I was adopted, and it was a pretty abusive and racist adoption.
What do you mean?
I was placed with a Puerto Rican white-looking woman who, while the light-skinned children got to go to a private school, she told me because I was black, I would have to go to a public school. And I would experience different types of abuses based on who I was. And so by 13, found myself couch surfing and trying to prove to the agency what was going on. But it was this tall, black-looking kid against this white, short-looking Puerto Rican woman. And I wasn't believed for a very long time until I started to record the abuse.
And you came up with a solution by watching what is one of my favorite shows, Law and Order.
Yeah, so it was one day I was watching Law and Order, and that was the moment where I realized I had to find evidence. I had to build evidence. So after that, I was able to be put back into foster care.
What was it like in those foster homes?
It was a roller coaster. So fostering is a calling, and some people are called to do the work, and some people, really see the mutual benefit of being able to survive leveraging that stipend that they get from the government.
It was only after he aged out of the system at 23 that Council discovered he had family members less than 60 miles away who would have taken him in. But, he says, they were never contacted.
We see this still happening today, but what is encouraging is that we're also seeing a lot of movement around making it better. There have been laws that have been passed in the last 3 years that people are really working hard to change this.
How much of it do you think is about race? Does it happen to all children, regardless of color, or is there a disproportionate impact if you're a person of color?
So what we know right now is that 53% of all black families will experience a child abuse investigation. 10% of all black children will experience foster care. That is twice the rate of white children. And so what we see is an over-surveillance of child welfare in communities that are poor. I think when you think of foster care, you think of child welfare, you think of folks who have probably been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, but 64% of the cases actually have to do with neglect issues that are coming from poverty, right? The lights, water are not running, not enough food. So we created a system that was supposed to be about protecting children from abusers, but what we really have is the majority of the children in foster care are experiencing high poverty issues.
So how did you get involved in this program that you're working with now?
So I started Think of Us with the premise that we should be fixing the system, re-architecting it in a way that we address the core problems that are around it. And so I truly envision that right now we can move from being a system that is mainly focused on placing children with strangers, right? Foster parents that they don't know, that we can move that to a system that supports grandma, uncle, cousins, people that the children already know and that are already related to, and figure out how do we support them in taking them in. Right now, only 33% of children are actually placed with a relative.
Where are the rest of them, in group homes?
We see that they're in foster homes, in group homes, and The difference that we're also seeing here is that when they are placed with a relative, that states are not supporting those families the same way that they would support a foster parent. On average, a foster parent gets about $800 in reimbursement a month for a child. But for many states, they provide no type of support or very little support to an actual grandparent or aunt and uncle who's taken them in.
I've seen you say that despite all of the division that we see politically these days, you've got some cooperation between the parties on this.
One of the things that I'm so encouraged by on child welfare particularly is that it is a bipartisan issue. But I think we need to go even further, right? We have a lot of agreement around foster care, but sometimes we think differently about kinship care. The idea when grandma takes in her grandchildren that she should just do that. And we need to shift our thinking to say, no, we should support grandma in being able to make sure that grandma has all the tools and resources that we would give a foster parent to keep that family together.
So what keeps you going? What makes you hopeful? You've used that word, so what is it?
I'm very hopeful because at the basis of what's happening right now, the money's changing in child welfare, what can be financed, the rules are changing in child welfare. But what I really want people to know is that this is an opportunity for us to ensure that children and young people get families and that we grow up with families and that every child should be able to feel someone who loves them past a contractual agreement. And this is the opportunity where we get to do that.
And you're hopeful that we can do this?
I'm confident that we can do this.
Well, Sixto Cancel, you make me hopeful just listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
For decades, Turkey has fought the PKK, a Kurdish separatist movement that's been designated a terror organization by the U.S. and other nations. The rebel group has sought refuge in northern Iraq, home to a significant Kurdish population. Over the years, Turkey has crossed into northern Iraq to fight the PKK, and more recently, the Turks have established dozens of military bases on Iraqi soil. PBS NewsHour special correspondent Simona Foltin gained exclusive access to Turkish-controlled parts of northern Iraq.
Behind this mountain in Iraq's northern semi-autonomous Kurdish region lies what authorities here call a red zone, a restricted area where Iraq's northern neighbor Turkey has been ramping up its military presence. Driving up the mountain road, we reach the last checkpoint of the Iraqi border guard. The commander here isn't allowed to speak on camera, but tells us 12 new Turkish military bases have been set up here over the past year, well inside Iraq's borders. Beyond this point, he says, Turkish forces hold de facto control over Iraqi territory. We're around 8 miles away from Iraq's border with Turkey, and this is essentially a militarized zone where Turkey has been building a growing number of bases and outposts, and we can actually see some of them on those mountaintops behind me. For decades, Turkey has carried out sporadic operations against the PKK, an outlawed Kurdish separatist movement considered a terror group by both the US and the European Union. The PKK aims to establish a Kurdish state across Kurdish-majority parts of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and it has long used these mountains as a base for its insurgency against the Turkish government. But the recent major expansion of Turkish military bases has raised fears of occupation. Down below the Turkish outposts, we find valleys emptied of civilians. Turkish operations have uprooted thousands of people in this area. Ali Mahmoud is one of few shepherds who've stayed behind to look after their livestock.
This is a military area now. We cannot go everywhere with our sheep. Many ways have been closed off.
During our 2-day visit, we heard several rounds of artillery being fired in the distance. One such strike hit Mahmoud's house in May, killing dozens of his animals and injuring 2 shepherds. He recorded this video the morning after. In just this area, 24 out of 26 villages have been emptied over the last couple of years. Mahmoud was forced to leave his village of Sharanish a few miles further north.
This is an encroachment on our lands. I had to relocate here temporarily. We hope we can go back to our village.
It's not safe for us to access the village, but detailed satellite imagery reveals the extent to which Turkey controls the area. This is the Turkish outpost we saw on our way, overlooking the road leading towards Sharanish. Perched atop the mountain to the north is another Turkish base. There are also two roadblocks, one before and one after Sharanish. The village itself, filmed here in 2019, has been damaged in Turkish strikes. Sharanish is completely deserted, this civilian says as he walks through its abandoned streets. The man who filmed the video fled to a nearby town and wanted to remain anonymous for fear of retribution. He told the NewsHour that Turkish forces haven't allowed anyone to go back.
We went to check on our houses, but they had blocked off the road, and when we approached, they fired warning shots.
Turkey has established around 40 military fixed points like this one across northern Iraq, with thousands of Turkish soldiers believed to operate on Iraqi soil. Iraq's federal government has criticized these maneuvers as illegal and has repeatedly summoned Turkish diplomats in the capital, Baghdad.
Nationalist group.
Ali Reza Gunni is Turkey's ambassador to Iraq.
We're going to continue till we believe that PKK is no more threat to Turkey.
Yet the Iraqi government has condemned your presence in the north as a violation of its sovereignty.
They can do, but they first have to do their own job. Each and every country has the right to be sovereign, but it requires also being responsible to keep your territories clean out of terrorists.
But Turkey isn't alone here. The armed forces of Iraq's Kurdish region, the Peshmerga, are building bases too. And while authorities in Baghdad publicly criticize Turkey's military incursions, the ruling party of Iraqi Kurdistan, constantly in dispute with the Baghdad government, has close economic relations with Turkey and has increasingly cooperated with the Turks in their fight against the PKK. Peshmerga commander Yassin Sharwani has come to inspect the new base. It's one of dozens built in this area to pressure the PKK to take its fight back to Turkey.
The PKK cannot be active here because it's not their area. Their area is in Turkey, but until now they haven't managed to control any villages there.
And while the PKK's aim is that greater Kurdish state, Sharwani says Iraq's Kurds have what they want.
We in Iraqi Kurdistan already have autonomy, and we have no problems. We have our own government.
But Kurdish authorities are also wary of igniting fresh tensions among the Kurds, who fought brutal wars among themselves. Although the PKK sometimes attacks them, many Peshmerga are not willing to fight their own brethren. Maruf Hala Ismail has been a Peshmerga fighter for 31 years.
I swear, if there's another fight between the Kurds, I will leave my weapon and go home.
I ask him if Turkey can defeat the PKK in this mountainous terrain.
They're trying to put pressure on them using drones. In my opinion, this has no impact on them. They are moving from this mountain to that one.
To see this new military strategy in action, we visited the Kandil Mountains, the PKK's bastion in Iraqi Kurdistan. To do so, we needed the PKK's approval and were accompanied by one of its members. Many civilians have fled the conflict, and those who've stayed behind, like Renas Zagros, are ardent PKK supporters who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause.
Life is really difficult. Every day there are drones and bombings.
During the interview, a Turkish drone hovers above the shop. Turkey has denied targeting civilians and has instead accused the PKK of using them as human shields. The nearly constant surveillance has forced the PKK's leadership into hiding. Its spokesperson was unable to meet for an interview. But we are able to get the PKK's perspective in the Mahmur refugee camp, 100 miles southwest of the Kandil Mountains. It was set up 23 years ago for Turkish Kurds uprooted by the Turkey-PKK conflict. The Turkish government has called the camp an incubator for militants and has repeatedly targeted it with airstrikes, killing both PKK fighters and civilians. Leila Arzu Ilhan is part of the camp management, comprised of PKK loyalists.
For sure we are afraid. Every 3 to 4 days there is a Turkish drone flying above and watching us, but it doesn't mean we will stop. We are revolting against Turkey's occupation.
Ilhan believes Turkey is using the PKK as a pretext for territorial expansion.
They are trying to return to the times of the Ottoman Empire. They are trying to enlarge their territory at the expense of minorities.
Iraqi officials say what's really needed is a political solution to end this decades-long conflict. But with none on the horizon, Turkey's fight against the PKK in Iraq has opened the door to long-term Turkish military presence and perhaps wider conflict for an already destabilized region. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Simona Foltin in northern Iraq.
Well, as we close the book on 2021, we wanted to share some good reads. Jeffrey Brown talks to some NewsHour literary friends to get their best recommendations on what to curl up on the couch with or share with a friend. It's part of our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
I'm joined here in studio by Carlos Lozada, the nonfiction book critic of The Washington Post. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2019. And from Brooklyn, Jacqueline Woodson, author of novels for adults, as well as Newbery Honor-winning titles for young readers. She was the Library of Congress's National Ambassador for Young People's Literature and a MacArthur Fellow last year. And it's really nice to see and talk to both of you. I feel like I always start with fiction, so for once we're going to start with nonfiction. Carlos, give us a couple of picks.
I want to start with two books that I think get to some current major crises we're facing, but do so in really novel ways. First is Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert. She's probably best known for her book, The Sixth Extinction, which depicted the crushing of the planet's biodiversity under the human footprint. This subsequent book is kind of a perfect sequel because it's a warning about how even very well-intentioned fixes to our environmental problems can end up causing more damage. It's kind of a pessimistic book, but I think a really important one.
Okay.
The second one I want to highlight is called Read Until You Understand by Farah Griffin.
That's a good title.
It's a great title, and the book actually, suits it very well. There have been so many books that try to get at this moment of wrestling with the challenges of racial justice. And Griffin's does so in a way that mixes memoir and political analysis and kind of a literature seminar all at once. What I like about this book so much is that it shows that reading is a vital part of engaged citizenship.
All right, Jacqueline Woodson. So to give us a couple of, novels, if you can, what have you got?
I can, and it's so funny because Carlos and I are so much on the same page in terms of the energy of what we're reading. I want to start with Mbolo Mbiu. Her book is called How Beautiful We Were, and it's a novel about an African village that is struggling against a big American oil company that's messing up their environment. So it's a book about environmental justice. It's a book about family. It's a book about when big American businesses come into communities in other countries and destroy them or set out to destroy them. And one thing I love about this book is it's so thoughtful, but it's also funny. I mean, she can get at the humor in some of the hardest places. Another book that I came by way of accident that just last night won the Center for Fiction's first novel award is a book called The Five Wounds by a woman named Kirsten Valdez Quaid. It's a book about a family where the teenage girl Angel gets pregnant and she shows up at her father's house on the day that he is practicing to play the role of Jesus in the town ceremony. But here's the thing that stood out about that book for me. One thing that Kirsten does is she uses Spanish and it's never italicized, which I love because what she's saying in this book is my language is not other, and this story is not other, and my people are not other. This was the first novel that really blew me away.
All right, Carlos, I mean, in terms of themes, I know you spent a lot of time looking at our politics and our divided politics. You have a couple from the past year?
Yes, I have read a lot of Trump books, way too many Trump books in my day job at the Washington Post. Yes. And a lot of them are of the, can you believe he did this or said that kind of school. But in the latest that are coming out, you start seeing books that are more sort of thoughtful and thematic and develop an argument. Two I want to highlight are, first, Reign of Terror by Spencer Ackerman. This book came out just a few months ago, around the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and it draws a very bright and clear line between the excesses of the 9/11 era and the excesses of the Trump presidency. It looks at issues such as, expanding presidential power, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment, weakening oversight, and just the open-ended nature of the war on terror, and shows how a lot of those things were kind of redirected and harnessed during the Trump years. The other is a book by Fiona Hill called There Is Nothing for You Here. And Fiona Hill is a Russia expert who was an advisor in the Trump White House and became best known probably when she testified during the first Trump impeachment regarding Ukraine.
NewsHour viewers will remember that well.
She looks at three places that she knows well: her native England, where she grew up in a working class mining town, Russia, which she studied as an academic, and the United States, which she's lived for many years and as a U.S. citizen, and shows how very similar cultural and economic forces are propelling the rise of populism in all three places. So she's uniquely positioned to tell the story, and it's the rare Trump book that doesn't obsess about Trump.
Jacqueline, put on your young reader's hat here. Give us a couple.
Your Legacy by Shelley Williams, which is a book about enslaved African Americans before they were enslaved. So it takes us back to different parts of Africa and shows us the culture and the grandeur and the wealth and the civility that people had before they were brought to this country as enslaved people. And I really love that book because it's not starting the narrative at enslavement. It's starting the narrative when people were people who were not enslaved. So, and another quirky book that I really love is Mo Willems, the beloved Mo Willems, wrote a book called Opposite Abstract, which is about concepts. And it's a really thoughtful way to talk about abstract images with very young people.
I want to ask you both before we go. I'll start with you, Jacqueline Woodson, on this one. Just, was there a book that you went back to this year, or that perhaps that you read for the first time, an older book that was particularly meaningful to you?
I'm so glad you asked that, Jeff, because I have been reading Ida B. Wells' autobiography, and it's just the book I needed. I needed to think about someone who survived harder times and who was brave in them and who changed a lot of the world and the work that she did. So Ida B. Wells, For the Win, was the book that got me through a lot this year.
Carlos, what about for you?
So I have many unread books in my home, many yet to be read books in my home. And one I picked up this year was Night Draws Near by Anthony Shadid, the late, great foreign correspondent and war reporter.
Absolutely.
So many of the best-known books about American warfare tend to be about the Americans, tend to be about how Americans go off, try to transform distant lands, and are transformed themselves by the experience. Shadid's book is different. Shadid looks at how the Iraq War was lived through the eyes of ordinary Iraqi people, the depth of his reporting, the empathy of his spirit. And he was able to show, for instance, how Iraqis can both despise a domestic dictator and resent the foreign occupier. And those two things are not inconsistent.
All right. I want to thank you both for sharing books and love of reading. Jacqueline Woodson, Carlos Lozada. Thank you very much.
As we look back at the last year, we've reconnected with a number of you, viewers and guests we've interviewed over the past year plus. We wanted to hear how you have handled the last 12 months, the challenges you faced, and your wishes for 2022.
Hi, my name is Monday Buski. I'm from Detroit, Michigan.
I'm Amy Scheid. I live in the center of Wisconsin. My name is Nora Galina. I live in Zephyr Hills, Florida.
My name is Marie Cheslick. I'm a registered nurse in the city of Chicago.
My name's Marissa Hackett. I am in Seattle, Washington.
Hi, I'm Matt Burzak. I'm an attorney and the father of a special needs son who has autism, who's 17, and a daughter who's 14. The pandemic and the uncertainty around it is very, very difficult for some people, especially my son Ben with special needs. He does do in-person school, but with a mask, which he finds frustrating. And especially for someone like Ben, who has trouble reading emotion, even in the best of times because of autism, masking is the kind of thing that makes it more difficult for him to interact and understand with people.
I thought everything would be better by now. And in certain aspects it is. The vaccines are available, but a lot of sad things have happened along the way.
In January 2021, I lost both my parents to COVID, and they passed within a week of each other. 6 months later, in July, I lost my older sister to cancer. It was difficult. Throughout this year, one of the other feelings that I had alongside with grief to try to temper that was one of gratitude, and gratitude of all the people helping us, feeling grateful for what I do still have left.
I'm seeing less patients with COVID in the hospital right now as opposed to in 2020 in November, but I'm seeing more of nurse staffing issues. I'm seeing more hospital issues. It's always been an intense job. It's always been a challenging job, but more now than ever, I'm focusing of just keeping my head above the water.
For almost 8 years, I owned a restaurant that sadly has now closed. People's view of the service industry had completely changed. We were seeing at the beginning, people creating banners and paying it forward and being kind and generous. And in the end, we were being spit on. We were being harassed. We had people who would come in and rip their mask off and drag it along the tables in the dining room. It was just an overall shock to see how divided our community and our country as a whole had become.
I'm scared on a bigger level at this point than I was in the beginning of the year, right after the insurrection. I'm seeing folks turn a blind eye to the gravity of what took place on January 6th. And I'm wondering if I'm watching the American experience fail in front of me, because this isn't democracy.
I'm an immigrant to the US. I was born in Argentina, but I grew up in New York, and I've been here since I was a small child and traveled back and forth to Argentina many years. And Argentina was always the crazy country where the governments were awful, and you had crazy inflation, and you had military coups, and that thing didn't happen in the US. This is where we were away from that, but we're not away from that so much anymore. And I find that kind of overwhelming.
The closing of the restaurant was one of the hardest things that I've done in my lifetime. And I think one of the hardest things was the amount of customers that were just heartbroken at the aspect of us closing. And we felt a real responsibility for that. They'd been so supportive, and we miss them.
If there is a word to use, it would probably be endure, because that is what me and my family have had to do, is to endure a massive amount of change and trauma and grief. And I think we've done a pretty good job of enduring and honoring their lives through this past year.
I'm a nurse, and I'm probably the most contagious person my friends are hanging out with, potentially, but I am hopeful. I am hopeful for the future, and I think we have to be.
I'm hopeful that things will get better, that I'll feel safer and feel more confident in engaging with the outside world. I'd like to travel more. I'd like to see my family more. I want to be with the people I love.
Through the midst of all of what we're seeing happen around us politically and socially, I just wish and hope and encourage folks to not forget to connect connect with the folks they love, do the things they love, and tell people they love them.
We have tried to keep our expectations short term, stay in the moment, and enjoy what we have. And, next year is going to bring what next year is going to bring. And as a caregiver to someone with special needs, it's our job, it's my job to adapt and, make next year better than this year.
We're so grateful to all of you for sharing your stories and your lives with us. Thank you. That is the News Hour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us here at the PBS News Hour, thank you for joining us. Please stay safe, and we will see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS News Hour has been provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular has been offering no-contract wireless plans designed to help people do more of what they like. Our U.S.-based customer service team can help find a plan that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Johnson & Johnson. BNSF Railway. The Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the News Hour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.